Ever wonder what really happens when a big company gets caught playing fast and loose with its numbers? We're not just talking about a little slap on the wrist here. We're talking about a full-blown investigation by the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. The SEC. Today, we're going to crack open the case files to see the real-world consequences for these companies, for their investors, and, yeah, even for their auditors.
So let's just get right to it with a simple question. What happens when the financial police come knocking on a company's door? What does that whole process look like? What are they even looking for? And, probably most important, what's the actual financial damage when the news finally gets out? Well, to find some answers, we're going to turn back the clock and dig into a really foundational 1991 study from the Journal of Accounting Research. The authors of this paper did all the heavy lifting for us. They sifted through hundreds of SEC enforcement actions from the 1980s to build a super detailed picture of corporate fraud and its fallout. This is our source material, our blueprint for today's explainer. Okay, first up, let's look at the crime itself. What exactly are these companies getting in trouble for? This part of our investigation is all about, you guessed it, cooking the books. You can think of the SEC as a team of financial detectives. Their whole job is to make sure the market is fair and transparent, which means they're on the hunt for companies that are presenting a misleading picture of their financial health. At the end of the day, their main goal is to protect investors from making decisions based on bogus information. Now, the official records for these investigations are called Accounting and Auditing Enforcement Releases, or for short, AAERs. You can just think of them as the SEC's case files. They're public documents that detail every allegation against a company and its leadership, laying out exactly how they bent or broke the rules. And this study we're looking at, it's built on a really deep analysis of 224 of these releases. So what does the typical fraud actually look like? By digging into all these case files, we can start to build a pretty clear profile. What were the most common schemes? Let's break down the anatomy of these financial crimes. If you had to guess the number one way companies cook their books, what would you say? Hiding expenses? Making up assets? Well, the data points overwhelmingly in one direction. It's all about revenue. Faking it, inflating it, or just booking sales way too early. And the data here is just, wow, it's incredibly clear. A stunning 50% of cases involved messing with accounts receivables. That's the money a company is owed. As you can see, this one issue just dominates. And when you combine that with improper revenue recognition, you see that issues related to overstating sales were a factor in over 70% of these investigations. It really speaks to the immense pressure companies face to meet those quarterly expectations and show constant growth. To see how this works in the real world, let's look at a case involving a name you'll definitely recognize. In one instance from the study, the SEC went after the toy giant Mattel. The allegation? That the company had fraudulently juiced its income by doing things like recognizing sales before they were really final and pushing expenses into a later period, all to make their earnings look way better than they actually were. But companies don't operate in a vacuum. There's supposed to be a line of defense against this kind of behavior. So now, let's turn our investigation to another key player in these scandals, the company's own auditors. That's right, it's not just the corporate execs who land in hot water. The SEC also investigates the external audit firms. These are the so-called watchdogs who are hired to independently check a company's financial statements. But what happens when the watchdog fails to bark? This slide breaks down the top reasons auditors were cited. And the number one issue, by a long shot, was a failure to obtain sufficient competent evidence, which in plain English means they just didn't do their homework. But you can also see other huge failures, like not independently verifying information and flat-out failing to follow their own audit procedures. Essentially, they weren't just being careless, they were cutting corners, and that's exactly how fraudulent numbers slip right through the cracks. We've seen the crime and we've seen the accomplices. But what about the consequences? How does the market, and by that I mean investors, react when news of an SEC probe finally breaks? Here is the punchline. When the first public disclosure of an investigation hits the news, the market's reaction is swift and it is brutal. The study found that, on average, a company's stock took a nearly 13% hit in just the 2-day window around that announcement. That's a massive loss of shareholder value almost overnight. And this wasn't some kind of fluke. The study's authors confirm this is a consistent pattern. The market absolutely hates uncertainty, and it punishes any hint of fraudulent reporting. This negative reaction happens even if the financial impact of the fraud itself is relatively small, because it destroys something way more valuable: trust. And that initial stock drop is just the beginning of a long, painful process. This timeline illustrates another key finding. These things don't get resolved quickly. The average time gap between the first public disclosure of a problem and the final settlement with the SEC was 24 months. That's 2 full years of legal battles, uncertainty, and negative headlines hanging over the company. The consequences weren't just financial. They were personal too. The study found that in 42% of the firms investigated, top managers, the people at the helm when the fraud happened, were either fired or forced to resign. This shows that the fallout goes right to the very top of the organization. So, after digging through these decades-old case files, what have we learned? What's the big picture takeaway from this deep dive into how our financial markets are policed?
Okay, let's recap our key findings. First, financial fraud is most often about faking sales to look more successful. Second, the auditors who are supposed to catch this are often cutting corners, failing to gather enough evidence. Third, the market delivers a swift and severe punishment, wiping out huge amounts of shareholder value. And finally, and maybe most importantly, this study reveals the true power of the SEC. It's not just about punishment after the fact. The mere threat of an investigation creates a powerful deterrent, creating a strong incentive for companies to play by the rules.
And that leaves us with one final thought. This study looked at data from the 1980s. So the crucial question for us today is, if this was the impact back then, in an era of slower news cycles and less connected markets, how much faster and more severe is the verdict of the market today? Definitely something to think about. Thanks for tuning in.